Alright everyone, welcome to a new Dominions 5 video, but today we're covering a little bit of a different topic. It's not a nation analysis, we're not even in-game. Today we're going over a topic requested by one of my patrons, which is to look at the theory of operations as it applies to Dominions 5. So that is taking the real-world conception of operations as opposed to strategy and tactics. So I'll explore those commons briefly, and then see how we can apply them in order to help you wage campaigns in Dominions more effectively. So this is advice that's not focused on the minutiae of scripting, it's not focused on diplomacy or grand strategy, it's focused on the situation wherein you're going into a war or you've decided to enter a war and you're in the planning phase to decide how you're going to win that war. Not its battles, but how you're going to win that war. So we're actually going to go through a bit of a slide presentation today, starting with a brief introduction to what on earth I'm talking about, because there's some of you that will be super confused and some of you will be really worried that I'm about to butcher these concepts. So let me start with the disclaimer. This is not some sort of staff college lecture. You are not a bunch of cadets. So what I'm going to be doing today will not cleave, strictly speaking, to the academic frameworks people normally put around strategic, operational, and tactical thinking. Seriously, I think I have one quote from a relevant manual in this, and that's only once. So reminder, I'm talking about Dominions 5, although a lot of what I say today, I'm hoping, will be relevant to other games as well. At a basic level, I'm hoping that what I say will be useful in a Dominions context. And we're starting with this framework that you see on the right. That is, it's sometimes useful when you're trying to pare down the sometimes overwhelming complexity of a game like Dominions or conflicts in general, to pare it down to a couple of levels. And there are models which break war down into 3, or depending on which one you read, 4 levels: strategic, operational, and tactical, in descending order of how high a level they operate at. The strategic and political level, so I'm just going to describe these quickly, and then, because they're not the topic that I'm going over today. Strategy, and above that, the political or sometimes the grand strategic layer, decides what a nation's overall objectives are. So in the real world, for example, the body politic, whether that's voters or the elites, depending on what sort of government you have, determine what the overall objectives and values of a nation are. Strategy crystallizes that into plans that will help advance or achieve that. Now, in Dominions, politics is a bit of a non-issue, because there's no danger of you having a disconnect between your military and political leadership. You, the player, are it, and you are the complete absolute dictator of the nation you control. So these things are always in alignment. What you are still limited by in this sphere are things like diplomatic expectations, other players, and also what you personally are trying to get out of the game. You may be in it to win it. You may be in it to play a good, honest game and give yourself a couple of learning experiences. It may be a challenge run. That takes the place of the political sphere in Dominions thinking. The strategic component of Dominions thinking, diplomacy, is in this sphere. God design is in this sphere. Research, your overarching research plan is in this sphere. It's the strategic element is how, in the big picture, you plan on taking your nation from turn 0 to the end of the game victorious, and all those elements play into it. Operations is the domain of lines on maps. It is how you move the various forces available to you, how you construct them, move them into position, as part of a campaign, or sometimes a series of campaigns aimed at moving towards the achievement of those sort of strategies that we talked about before. Now, operations as an area is sometimes a little bit maligned. It's a victim of people using very colloquial senses of the word strategy and tactics. A lot of the time when someone says, hey, what's your strategy for this particular battle or whatever, they're really asking what sort of tactics you're planning to employ. And operations sort of drops out. Specifically, in the Dominions context, operations is the domain of moving your armies around on the map, how you compose those armies, not how you script them, but how you compose them, the logistics you put behind them to make sure that reinforcements are reaching the front, that gems are reaching the front, that items are forged in advance. So it's your forging and it's your campaign planning. Sorry, I jumped over tactics there for a moment. And then there's tactics. So this is battles, engagements. You can see peak tactics on the right-hand side of the screen. throw 5 less hell hurtings at it and it dies. That's peak tactics and dominions right there. So this is probably the most popular topic in warfare for amateur study. People love tactics. It's how do you win a particular engagement. It's the domain where the superiority of a particular piece of equipment really matters. Oh, if a Tiger's taking on a Sherman, a Tiger's superior, so the Sherman's going to need really good tactics to counter it if you're a World War II sort of person. But really, it's not the be-all and end-all. It's concerned with the question of the battle is started or the battle is imminent. How do I use the resources available to win a particular engagement or a fight? And in Dominions, this is the domain of army scripting, your formations, and it can make you look like an absolute badass because there are people who know this game inside out and can do some miracle work with their scripting. People who know how to make elephant expansion work perfectly, how to unleash tramplers. People who can make scripts that fire just so and perfectly balanced communions. That is superior tactics, but it won't always win the game because if you are in the wrong war or you're winning the wrong battles or you're winning them at too great a cost because you're up against too many opponents at the same time, for a myriad of reasons, tactics helps, but it may not win you the game. So we're going to leave that. That's the domain of most guides. It's a number of topic videos. Today, we're occupied with that middle question of operations. And just to sort of crystallize these concepts in your mind, this terrible slide gives you the illustrative questions I have for these ideas. Butchering the concepts, but hopefully bringing them home. Political asks, is the war worth winning? Do I want to be in this war? Is this the right war? Strategy, that question having been decided, strategy asks, how do I win this war? Operations then asks, how do I win this campaign? With the campaigns being the tools you use to win a war, and tactics being, how do I win this battle within the campaign? They don't always fit super neatly within each other, but in general, it's a hierarchy. This is a fun. So just to illustrate this concept really quickly, I thought I'd really quickly give some stupid jokey ratings to the Axis powers from World War II and see how they compared. So you can see that being good in one area doesn't necessarily mean you're capable in another. Please, these are not academic ratings, but they're meant to be illustrative. So we talked about Germany. Operationally, in terms of how they actually conducted themselves in combat as part of campaigns, you see particularly in the early years of the war, but right out to 43, really level A in terms of a lot of the operations they carried out, particularly in France. Campaigns that exploit the weakness of the opponents, generate tremendous uncertainty, that were backed up by tactical skill and acumen and aggression at the localized level. Their logistics were a little bit weaker, particularly as the war went on, mostly because even though they had a great ability to improvise, logistical planning wasn't given the same, I suppose, pride of place that it had in other forces. Strategic, you start to get a bit shaky, and when you talk about the grand strategic level, well, it's very hard to see how they ever could have won. How the strategy they put in place, which was based on bullshit ideology and going up against all the major world powers seemingly at once, how that ever could have paid off. It was a bit of a shonky strategy. Italy's even worse in this context because its grand strategy was based often on ad hoc decisions being made on a whim of a singular dictator. So Mussolini's decision to enter the war against France was based on not wanting to miss out and decided seemingly on a lark. Their strategic plan to actually win never seems to have come through. When they did enter the war, they didn't have a consolidated idea of how they could even conceivably win it, other than wait for Germany to win it for them, other than some offensives in Africa. Their operational conduct was often extremely poor, their logistics were embarrassing, and this more than the quality of the individual Italian soldier gives them a terrible reputation. If you're poorly supplied, poorly trained, poorly officered, you're going to be pretty bad. Tactics, they weren't great in terms of tactical operations in most cases. There are places where the Italians acquitted themselves quite well. They were capable in sort of defensive fighting occasionally, but they also fell apart other times. So I'll give them a C here. Not a great operation rating overall. Then there's Japan. Japan, they surprise people at the tactical level a lot of the time. The quality of their operations varies over the course, so somewhere between B and C. Their logistics were often terrible, but again supported by an ability to improvise and also just accept discomfort on the part of their troops. The reason I included Japan here is because from a grand strategic perspective, you kind of have to give them worse than an F. This is a country that was at the limits of its industrial and war-making potential, exertions, its capabilities, really like 1940, where like 70% of the government budget was going into the military to not win the war in China. They were stalled in China. It was essentially a stalemate. And they reached the point where they decide that because the war in China requires lots of strategic resources, the solution to that problem is to start another war with the Dutch, with Britain, and with the United States of America. If you was to apply this to a Dominion context, let's just say that you have 15 provinces, you're at war with your neighbor, it's kind of not going anywhere, you're trading blows back and forth. So you decide what you really need is more cash and gems and province income in order to build the forces you need to defeat that guy. So to get those, what you do is you declare war on the 45 province superpower next door. It doesn't make sense then, and it didn't make sense then. So there you are. That's how a failure on strategic level can mean that even if you're capable of decent tactics and operations, the entire scheme can be doomed from the start because the war you entered into was batshit. So we're going to break operations up into a couple of phases. I'm going to talk about a couple of aspects of planning, so planning for the different types and phases of operations. We're going to talk about setting goals. We're going to talk about considering your assets, aka your ways and means, how you actually conduct what you have available to you and what you need available to you to conduct a good operation. We're going to talk about planning, logistics, and then I'm going to go through execution by phase. I call it by phase. You could also call it by type. If you're not following, don't worry. Hopefully it should make sense as we go on. So I said there was exactly one place in this presentation that I steal from a field manual. I think this is FM3-0. It's old, it's publicly released, it's US Army, and it's the operations field manual, and it basically charts the domain of operations and also the types or phases of operations that you're going to be looking at. So what you're seeing there is you've got operation shaping, deterrence, the phase where you seize the initiative, the phase where you dominate your opponent, so where you dominate or destroy your opponent, and then it slowly moves its focus towards stabilizing the area that you've taken over or conquered and enabling whatever non-military authority comes in after you. In a Dominions context, my comments on this are the shaping phase really matters, how you stage your forces and create a good environment for your operation before the war even begins matters. So I'm going to talk about it a fair amount. Deterrence is also immensely important. Deterrence in the real world is a little bit easier and simpler because not everyone is a warmongering maniac out to conquer everyone. In the Dominions context, everyone wants to win the game probably, and everyone's representing a theocratic dictatorship in which the losers get sent to hell and the winner gets like eternal life and unlimited power. So people are kind of more predisposed to go to war in Dominions, which means the amount of effort that you need to put into deterrence becomes more significant. Seizing the initiative is critically important. This is the domain of elfing, of remote attacks, of massive broad front advances, and catching your opponent off guard. The dominate activities, this is the main battle phase of a campaign. This is where you are seeking to do one of two things, or both at the same time. Destroy the will of your opponent to keep fighting, to the point where they sue for peace, they surrender, they give you what you want, a nap, and you go away. Or you're destroying their capacity to resist, in which case they are no longer a warfighting entity and they'll either surrender or you conquer them entirely. The target in Dominions is usually capacity because most wars end in eliminations eventually because everyone is going to eliminate at least a few people if they're going to win, probably. It would be rare for that not to happen. So targets are usually things like armies, forts, provinces. So the military, the kinetic assets that let you wage war, and the economic assets that let you support and generate those warfighting assets. Stabilizing, enabling is sort of like a lol nah. We'll talk about them a bit, but the reality is in a Dominions context, It's not the complex real world. You don't actually care about the quality of life of the people in the areas you're operating in. What you care about is winning the conflict, and the economy is really abstracted, so there's not much for you to do there. We'll talk about the little bits that you do have to do towards the tail end of an op. So, any good operation. So, let's just take a step back here for a moment. You are at the point now in a game where you've decided that in order to win, so you've done the strategic calculation, in order to win, I probably need to knock out that guy. Either because they're going to get too strong eventually, their nation scales too much, they have thrones that you need. There is a reason that you have decided to go to war with them. There is a strategic imperative. You're now planning the actual conflict, the operation that will initiate that conflict. The first question you need to ask yourself is, what is the goal? What are you trying to accomplish? Generically advancing and making it up as you go along is okay. You can even win some Dominions games that way. But if you want to leverage these concepts and go into a war in the best possible position, it's helpful to set some goals and guidelines because it'll help crystallize the rest of your planning. I've got some examples here. I want to take his capital within 4 turns. I want to take those thrones. I'm going to eat all of his land. Maybe he's betrayed a nap with you, and your only goal of your operation is to BBC his provinces until they go completely tilt because they broke an app with you. Maybe the goal of an operation can be literally just to deny your opponent resources and to drive them insane. That's a valuable potential goal if you want to establish a reputation for not responding well to nap breaks, for example. But don't misuse that goal. So first, set a goal which you consider to be realistic and aligned with what you need to achieve. The second thing to then consider, because we will come back to goals, will come back, but first we need to talk about assets because it plays into it. There's 2 questions here. Firstly, what do you have available to you? And the flip side there is, what does the enemy have available to them? The more stuff you have relative to your opponent, the wider the scope of your operation can likely be, and the more long-term it can likely be. The second question is, what do you need to be available that you don't have available to you? Let's just say your goal is to take someone's capital and you're an elf nation and you've just finished expansion. You might answer the question is, okay, my available assets are all my elf expansion parties and a couple of thugs I've done up. What I'm missing is the assets I'm going to need to knock down that fort. It's not good enough to build those once the war is already begun. When you're in the planning phase, identify you're going to need that siege chaff and get it constructed and moving to the front before the conflict begins, ideally. This is a nice way, a very simple way of breaking down what kind of force elements you can bring in. So I've split this into initiative units and counter units. SCs are an odd one. Your initiative units, so the units that are doing your offensive action, the ones that are winning the war, they're taking ground, they're breaking down your opponent's will and capacity to resist. Split into raiding units and armies, at least initially. The goal of a good raider is a raiding unit, because it can be a thug or it can be a squad of units. Ideally, it'll be cheap, it'll be mobile, it'll defeat PD with minimal attrition. So thugs and groups of units that are stealthy is a very good attribute here. Stealthy, flying, mobility, it's all very good. The goal here are things that can flexibly take provinces and threaten the widest possible space with minimal attrition. That's what should take most of your opponent's territory, because it's a waste to use the second category of things to take most provinces one at a time. And these are armies. Armies are large collections of units, often with mage support. In fact, almost inevitably with mage support as the game goes on. The goal of armies is twofold. They destroy enemy armies, so bigger, and I say bigger here in a general sense. It can be larger, but it also has to be qualitatively superior. Just the bigger, better armies beat smaller armies. And the more your army has an advantage over an opponent's army, the fewer losses you take in the process. If you take 2 evenly matched armies against each other, they're both going to suffer horrific losses. But if you make one army 4 times the size of the other, the one that's got 4 times the size is actually going to take fewer losses, all else being equal. increasing your own firepower essentially reduces your own casualties. The other role, of course, armies have is they're the siege strength, they break forts, and they seize forts. The relationship of army size means that improving the investment in an army is rewarded by reducing your casualties when you fight enemy armies. But I've also put here, beware of the golden fish paradox, which is if your army is so overcharged and so resource intensive that it's actually over-engineered for the task, you're never going to be able to commit it, because if you lose it, you're out of the game. And the bigger an army gets, the more, ironically, vulnerable it is to things like spikes and super combatants, because there's more, it can be more cost effectively countered. What do I mean by that? Well, let's just say, let me use a remote attack as an example. It's not on this page. Let me use remote attack to illustrate the concept. If your army is 200, let's say 200 birds and 20 mages, perfectly capable of wrecking most armies, cracking forts in one turn, seizing them, etc. And your opponent is considering whether or not they want to cast flames from the sky. Those fire gems will get them a certain number of casualties, right? If you increase the size of that army to 800 birds and 80 mages, well, it's still going to beat any army it comes up against, but it was going to beat that at a smaller size anyway. And now, if your opponent is able to deploy, is more likely to risk a very expensive remote attack or a super combatant that may or may not work. And if they do work, they'll do proportionally more damage. Sorry, in absolute terms, more damage than what they would have done if the army was smaller. So armies want to scale and get larger than their opponents. They want to be big enough for the job, but they don't want to be so big that they can be super cheaply and efficiently countered. Counter units counter raiding units and armies. So thug/raid counters are tools that are designed to counter your opponent's raiding unit, whether that be a bunch of units or a thug or whatever. So counter thugs that can cloud trapeze are an example of something that fits into this category. The goal here is, again, for them to be cheap and mobile, so the same characteristics as raiding units. The difference is that instead of being geared to fight PD, they're geared to fight whatever your opponent is used to raid. And then there's spikes and SCs. SCs exist to kill armies generally. Using them to just take provinces is less efficient than using raiders, so super combatants tend to be a special purpose and research intensive tool. They can have secondary purposes, like, for example, screening for an army, preventing enemy armies making contact with your army. So if your army is full of siege chaff and is soft and squishy, you can use super combatants to prevent enemy armies walking into your army as it advances towards its goal. But they're usually pretty research intensive. Spikes, I'm not sure if this term is popularly used. I've used it in some of my videos. What I'm talking about in terms of a spike is like a trap or a drop and cast army wiper. So it's the Agarthan with Earthquake in a cave who then retreats, but after killing a bunch of guys with Earthquake, it's the teleporting immortal dude who casts Wind of Death and then leaves, watching all the Ormish dudes die. They're tools which, for a certain investment, do an increasing amount of value worth of damage the larger the force that they sent up against is. And the larger the army, the more cost-effective a spike option is. The comparison I've got here, I've said, do you use the tank to kill a tank? Using an army to kill another army is analogous in the real world to using a tank to kill a tank. What you really want to do is use an anti-tank weapon to kill a tank, an ATGM or a helicopter with a Hellfire missile on it or something. Using the specific counters is applicable to this. Your operations should consider all four of these categories just to make sure you haven't forgotten anything. What are your raiding units that are going to take the majority of the territory? What are your armies that are going to defeat your opponent's armies and take his forts? Do you have spikes or super combatants available to you? You may not if it's in the early game. And do you have thug/raid counters? Do you have units to kill the enemy's thugs, its raiders, and also those counter thugs are also usually what will kill enemy super combatants. Great. So we're moving into the the execution, planning the actual execution. This is planning the actual conflict itself, drawing the lines on the map. Now, I don't think, and this might sound weird for some of you who've seen some of my playthroughs, I don't think you need to plan massively far in ahead all the time. I also don't think you need to be superbly detailed all the time. There are a couple of things that govern how detailed and how far in advance your plan probably should go. Mobility and risk are the driving factors in how detailed and how far your planning can go. And I've illustrated this on screen. Let's just say we're concerned with an enemy force that is sitting at that red X in the middle of the screen. If that is an Agarthan army, and I'm planning an offensive against this area, on the first turn after I attack, so the first turn when the opponent can start counter-moving, the squares in that red box are threatened. They can't cross the river unless it's frozen. Let's pretend it's not frozen, and they've got non-swimming units in the army. So they can walk. They can walk one province in each of those directions. So I can actually afford to plan offensives that curl around that northern flank pretty freely. And I know what I'm going to have to do to use it. I just have to allocate the appropriate raiding forces, and I can timetable it. I can be a little bit adaptive, but I can go in advance and in depth. If I'm fighting Nazca and there's a stack of condors at the red X, then everything in the blue circle is threatened once they start to respond. And that means that your plans need to be more focused, shorter term, and include greater redundancies. You need to introduce more doubt into your opponent's mind in that context over your movements, otherwise they can take advantage of you. This is why my fourth dot point here is elves and birds are a real pain from an operations planning perspective, because planning should be based on an understanding of what your opponent has and what your opponent can or is likely to do. And the more mobile your enemy is, the less you have an ability to force or predict particular moves, because they have so many more options available to them, which means in order to contain or constrain their freedom of action, you need to eliminate a greater and greater share of all possible available moves. So, when you come to this phase, you might draft out, for example, which provinces you want to take, which forces are going to be sent to those provinces, and in so doing give consideration to where enemy forces are known to or might be. This is why intelligence is really important. And then shape increasingly general directives as things get less certain. So for example, if I'm fighting Agartha, I can plan the first couple of turns of this war that sweeps up that northern part of the screen and advances my main army towards that red square, for example. Past that, I probably just need general directives, because I need to prepare for a scenario where that army has decided to double back across the river to the left and defend those provinces, or he's coming to fight a main battle engagement with me across the river to the right. It's less about having a particular timetable and more about having particular general directives at that point, an understanding of how you will respond based on the general posture that your opponent adopts. Logistics is the other point. And this is one I think people often forget. When you fight a war in Dominions, you burn through a lot of material very quickly. You will need replacements. You'll need replacement troops. You may lose mages, which means you need replacements of those, particularly if you've got a couple of mages doing really key buffs on your armies. Also, late game armies consume gems at a prodigious rate. They chew through gems. So, you need to have a logistical plan that is going to move up replacement troops, replacement mages, have replacement items forged and ready, and keep getting gem reloads to the front. Because if your army is caught burned out of its gem reloads, then it may be destroyed relatively cheaply by your opponent. I will put the caveat there are some risks on how you control gem resupplies, but you should write them into your planning. You need to have a plan to get gem reloads and replacements to the front. And often this means, even if forces cannot be ready for an engagement, they need to be being built and moved as you initiate so that they can then filter forward and become the reinforcements. The importance of this is again related to the mobility of your units. If you are a Garther, you need to plan 15 steps ahead because you take very slow, very deliberate steps. If you are Nazca, then you can afford to channel a little bit of the improvisational art, but you should still do significant planning. The final note I put here is that there can be a morale impact of really good logistics. If your opponent is knocking down your forces, but you continue to advance and it doesn't seem to actually degrade you, like if there is a replacement there, if for everyone that falls another one takes its place, if no matter how many gems he burns through, you always seem to have a reload, that can have a really significant impact on getting in your opponent's head, their perception of how the war is going. They can't see that your gem stocks are draining. They can't see the expenditure that's going into replacing those units relative to your economy. All they know is that you are taking the punches and you seem to be able to regenerate them almost instantly. And then there's the actual, this is just some general notes on execution. I've included my little spreadsheet of how I manage execution. This is just a couple of notes I have once you get to the actual phase of executing an operation before we talk about the specific phases. The first is adaptation is super important, but there's a reason you plan in the first place. Having a plan available to you gives you a template to work from. It helps guide your thinking. It eliminates the risks of human error, i.e. that you will forget something or miss something. The planning process surfaces a lot of that and brings it to the fore. The spreadsheet I have above is an example. Doing that very deliberate inventory of all the super combatants and thugs we had available to us identified where there were gaps, how we might use them, and helped us plan where they would need to be and what we need to produce. As the operation goes on, you should identify opportunities to expand the scope if it's going really well, or if you're bashing your head up against a wall, you need to know when to walk away and go home. The final point I'll say here is there's value in trying to remember that this is a mental game, minimizing your mental load, and there's a couple of ways to do that, but the cheapest, the simplest way to do that in-game is just use a whole bunch of modular, highly mobile tools. So the enemy has lots of different threat vectors that they can deal with, while at the same time, you having mobile assets, whether they be remote attackers or things with flying and high mobility or stealth troops or whatever, they give you a little bit of a cushion mentally, knowing that however the battlefield evolves, you should be able to adjust your ongoing operation by moving other troops or bringing new assets up to the front. Other thing I do is for every Dominions game I'm playing at a time, I tend to keep a spreadsheet, and this is my list of naps, notes, major armies and where they are and what's in them at a glance, so I don't forget things. I tend to just track this so that before I do every turn, I just have a quick look at what's happened, update my sheet, go over it, and then I commence the process of doing the turn. So here we are. The other element of turn or execution and turn order that I want to talk about is a couple of more general points, essentially, before we get on to actually planning the various phases of a major operation. The first is understand the turn order sequence. You can go onto the Dominions wiki and go through this. A lot of the strategies in Dominions that you'll use at the operational level on the strategic map in the way you interact with your armies rely very heavily on the order in which Dominions processes a particular turn. So, for example, understanding how stealth interacts with remote attacks, understanding how dropping mages triggers a different phase of battle than just moving those troops conventionally, understanding what happens if you jump your forces onto an enemy fort and the enemy tries to remote jump onto their fort and how they won't touch your troops because they'll land in the courtyard. These are intricacies of the Dominion system, and they play into your system and your planning, so understand them. And again, I'm just reiterating movement and flexibility, really important here for making life easy for you and hard for your opponent. Control M, I believe, is the shortcut when you have an army selected to show how many movement points it needs to move to a given square. You can do that in order to track where your opponent's armies are likely to be able to move. If you don't want to manually count provinces and terrains, check for roads and stuff yourself, Control M will help you do it. Just remember, if they're flying or have survivals, the calculation will be different. And then take advantage of all the simple tools that make your planning life easier and your opponent's life harder. Standard army configurations make it more simple for you to put together a basic unit of action. So for example, when I was playing Nazca, my unit of action, a standard army that I would produce, would equal a summoning of condors. So that was, at the time, 20 condors is now 15. So it would be 15 condors, 4 or 5 condor warriors that were being produced at the same time from the capital, all without them, and then a group of maybe 40 Hartoon Runa and a commander, a sacred commander, in order to lead them. That was my standard army configuration. I didn't have to think and assemble. That was what I knew worked, and it's what I could produce in a standard number of turns, and I could just move combinations of those units. Raiders make your enemy's life harder. It takes a lot more brain power to counter raiding than it does to initiate raiding, so the more raiding you do, the harder your opponent's life is, all else being equal. There are times you don't want to raid. Remote shenanigans, again, getting inside your opponent's head, upsetting their planning process. The more uncertainty you can introduce, the better. Spikes make your enemy doubt every move, so if they know that if they move their army onto yours, they might encounter your army, or instead you might just be moving in a guy with a Ring of Returning, a bunch of pen gear, who's going to cast Wind of Death and make all their Black Plate infantry melt. That was in a game that I posted on my channel, where I'm pretty sure Varna Roos pulled that shit on Ulm, who is a classic target for that kind of stuff. Again, they're going to doubt all of their tools. So, finally, let's get on to the different phases of an operation as you want to have conceived it. So the shaping phase, or shaping operations, this has a comprehensive meaning in actual use. I'm going to usefully misuse it in order to apply it to dominions and say this is the stage where it's the preconditions for an operation. It's the planning and elements that you want to put in place before the first move is made. This includes a couple of points here. It means planning and gearing your production to what you'll need with contingency. So don't go into an operation with whatever you've thrown together. Ideally, if you've got time to plan, think about what you're going to need and produce it and get it to the front beforehand. If you need a certain number of mages for a certain number of buffs, get them there first. Don't try and hack together what you have to unless it's an emergency. Get everything moved up to the front. Have replacements moving, even if they're not going to be there when your operation begins. Reinforcements moving to the front to sustain your momentum once you commence are important. Deception operations to help shape the operational environment. So it's not just about positioning your troops and influencing where you're going to be stationed at the commencement of an operation. It's about where the opponent is going to be. And this can veer into the strategic in a sense, but from an operational perspective, things like deploying army size concealment, expansion or contraction units, so expanding the size of armies elsewhere, and subtracting the size of armies where you're concentrating, or using stealth, and coupling occasionally with a little bit of diplomatic shenanigans just to keep the messages a little muted, can help create the optimal positioning for an operation. I've got here a little bit of begging saying, don't just send whatever you've got in a death stack ball, please. Now, there are occasions where a death stack is the appropriate tool. If you're going to take a death stacks are good at killing smaller death stacks. That's what they do. They kill smaller armies that are not geared to fight them with lower attrition. We've talked about this in force composition. But in every other context, the death stack can be a little bit vulnerable, and also its presence will usually trigger an opponent's knowledge that an offensive is up. There's another element here to shaping that is obvious, but I'll mention anyway. If you're going to need items and gems for your offensive, get the items and gems first. If you need thistle maces and boosters and death sticks and whatever to make sure that your army can do all the cool stuff that you've researched, get it set. Deterrence. The deterrence phase, here the idea is if we want to launch an operation, we want to deter the target of that operation from spoiling our offensive, so you don't want them to act first, nor do you want other people who aren't the subject of the operation to act on you beforehand. So the intent of the deter phase is to prevent an adversary from undesirable actions through the posturing of friendly capabilities and demonstrating the will to use them. That's the classical definition. Let's play on this a little bit. More simply, I say you want an operation to commence on your terms, and there's a range of tools you can use in Dominions in order to deter your opponent from acting first. We talked about some of these, so the army size and placement. You can have, if there are score graphs, you can use those in order to deter an opponent in a particular way. You can, if you are a particularly well-known player with a good record, and this is getting a bit meta, you can play on that name in order to deter people. I probably wouldn't scare people because people don't fear me because I'm good with armies. But if you were Chris Lighthawk or something, then yeah, you can say, look, mate, you can attack me, but I'm probably going to kill you. Even if your plan is to then attack them 2 turns later. If you're Headalas and you have a record for even if you don't win the game, certainly making sure that whoever attacks you first loses the game, you can play on that. Counter value capabilities. Okay, so this is the ability to inflict damage on what matters to the enemy, even if it doesn't save you. So if, for example, you are a nation with the ability to cast province-destroying spells, or if you have a whole bunch of Bane Venom charms, or if you have a way to be really, painful to an opponent, and target their economy and their incomes, even if you can't stop their armies, which would be counter force capabilities. So counter force, fighting the enemy force, counter value, fighting enemy value. Then that might deter them from starting a war and allow you to start the war on your terms. This is all strategic political sphere stuff most of the time, but you can have operational elements to it in terms of how you posture your armies and the capabilities that you show. If, for example, you show that you have BVCs and you've demonstrated those on other people, for example, then you can use them as a deterrence, although you might just tilt people and get them to murder you. Then we talk about seizing the initiative. I'm mostly talking about offensive operations here, but even on the defensive, seizing back the initiative is really handy. And that's why the first dot point I have here is that seizing the initiative is more than just attacking people. It's about who's choosing what the next step of the campaign is. If you are on the defense, but the attacker is in fear of what you might do, the attacker does not have the initiative. If he is walking through the jungle and he's really worried because the trees are all speaking Vietnamese, the trees have the initiative, not the poor grunts walking through the jungle. There are simple and there are difficult ways to seize the initiative as part of an operation. Elfing and deep strikes are easy mode. They instantly put your enemy into reactive mode. They lose a lot of his territory. He needs to respond because the damage to his economy is significant, or her economy is significant. So they need to respond. And in focusing on the response, their ability to spare forces and also just mental load for counter-offensives is diminished. You can cover, and this is an operational concept the Germans, for example, get away with a lot in the Second World War. You can cover a lot of vulnerabilities by putting the enemy mentally and on the back foot operationally. Time and time again, unsupported German columns racing towards their objectives. They get into the lines of communication, and if you give a snapshot of that scenario to a cool group of hindsighted cadets, not experienced generals, cadets, officer cadets, you give them a map and a situation and a table of organizational equipment and an appraisal of the unit conditions, and they have perfect information. They look at that situation, they'd go, haha, the Germans have walked their way into a trap. We will now cut their forces off and destroy them. But that's not what happens. Because the person on defense feels like they're being attacked, they feel overwhelmed, and having the initiative allows you to cover a whole lot of your own vulnerabilities and sins. I've said here, initiative begets the initiative. That is, and aggression can cover a lot of sins. If you keep an opponent responding to you, you can get away with things a lot longer, even if you are the weaker competitor. If you are the weaker nation, but you are the one doing the majority of the moves and dictating how the war is fought, you will last a lot longer than you will once your opponent works out the situation and decides to ignore what you're doing and initiate their own campaign. So, to this end, if you are a high mobility nation, the planning should write itself. You should commence an operation hitting as many targets as possible or threatening as many targets as possible, all else being equal. Put threats in place that command your opponent's attention and his forces. If you're a slower nation, one, get stuff that lets you go faster and be more flexible. There's usually something you can do. But even if not, for a slower nation, a broad front advance, that means that every army you've advanced can now move to multiple squares, and as a result, there's a lot for your enemy to respond to, is an equivalent. The Doom Tide can have the initiative, and indeed sometimes it can inexorably have the initiative, because all else being equal, slower nations in dominions tend to get more combat power per cost in exchange for being slower. Agarthan armies are slow, but per gold or per gem, they're pretty tough. Okay, so the first phase, the first move generally of your operation, first 1 or 2 moves have given you the initiative. You are now dictating how the operation proceeds. You move into the dominate phase. And what the goal of the dominate phase is tied to what the goal of the operation is. But generally it falls into 2 categories. Either you are trying to break your opponent's capacity to resist or their will to resist. And often you're trying to do both at the same time. You can break someone's will to resist by taking away their capacity to resist. If they've lost all their armies and their forts, they're likely to give up. The reason I draw the distinction here is that just like in real life, although to a lesser extent, it's possible for conflicts to end with peace treaties rather than total destruction. If your goal is someone's complete annexation, there's not much reason to talk about peace and talk about will to resist, unless your goal is to make them stop trying as hard and go AI. And some people will never do that. They'll just get more spiteful the more you push. But if your goal is just to get a few provinces or to grab a fort, if when you were setting your objective up at the start, you wanted this to be a limited war, the dominate phase can be targeted at your opponent's will to resist, and things can get a little bit more nuance. So while most of the time this is like the take and hold phase, where your goal is to take territory and forts, reduce your opponent's capacity, because the fewer forts and provinces they have, the less they can regenerate their forces, and the more damage you do to their forces, the less they can regain their territory to rebuild their forces. That interrelationship is obvious. If all you are after is for your opponent's will to resist is to break down, then your operation can instead focus more on driving them completely mad and illustrating the futility of future conflict. The dominate phase, for example, if you are a water nation and you are raiding a land nation over a limited objective, say just holding an enclave, may not have to destroy your opponent's capacity. It may not mean taking a single enemy fort. It may just mean relentlessly raiding coastal provinces, picking off lone armies, finding, if they're blood hunting, find their blood hunters and kill them. Just make life really shitting hard until eventually they throw their hands up in the air and say, look, you can have your enclave and a nap 5, go away. So this phase of the operation is where most of the conflict takes place, and its goal is either the destruction of capacity or will, but usually both. Then there's the soft and fluffy phases of operations, which don't really matter a whole bunch in Dominions. So the stabilisation phase, this is a real deal, real big deal. There's a whole bunch of literature about this in real life. In Dominions, things are very, very simple. And normally the stabilise phase is about bringing back stability to the area that you have conquered, the area of operations. In dominions, this just takes the form of getting the conquered land secured and productive as quickly as possible. And there's a few notes here which people can often forget. The first is unrest can eat an ungodly amount out of your income. And when you've just taken over territory, it's likely to have quite high amounts of unrest just from all the combat that's taken place on it. So getting that PD'd or patrol down, getting dominion spread, can make a huge difference to the economic value of the land that you've taken. It may not also be searched, which means you need to search it because otherwise you're foregoing gem income. Forts are probably going to be missing temples because you have destroyed those temples, unless you're one of the weird nations that can repurpose temples. Get those temples rebuilt. This is all simple and easy to forget stuff. If you're a nation that gets really cheap patrollers, bringing them in behind your armies to get unrest down quickly might be an option, and bringing in site-searching rainbows or mages or whatever you're using behind your forces might be something to consider. The final phase we will completely ignore because Dominions is terrible. In the real world, there is a phase called enabling, which is where, and this is specific to like large-scale campaign operations, where you're talking about like enabling civilian government and transitioning out of military operations into civilian conduct. Like that's questionable to even include under the study of operations anyway, like whether it's the same or something separate, either way. In Dominions, there is no civilian government. No one's got any rights. There is only the will of the awakening god and the religious total all-in conflict that is the Ascension War. This is a conflict in which people summon plagues, create the Harvester of Sorrows and Eater of the Dead, where they blot out the sun, or where they contaminate the very ether with blood magic in the form of astral corruption. Ascension Wars are no-hold-bars fight to the death, in which everyone is under perpetual total military mobilization. There is no enablement phase. Whoops, I pressed the wrong button there. And so with that, we're done. My advice, simply to recap, is make sure that you've defined a goal for your operation early. Be clear about what it is you want to accomplish with your forces, make it real, make it manageable, and tailor it to the resources involved. Determine what resources you have and what you need, and what your opponent has and what they might create in order to decide what the scope of the operation is. Build your forces out of the tools that are available to you. Create a plan which matches your mobility, your enemy's mobility, the choices that are available to you. The less reactive your opponent is, the more detailed your plan can be. The more reactive your opponent is, the more general the parts of your planning might have to be. Plan for your logistics. Use tools in order to mitigate the difficulties on yourself, while also deploying tools which maximize the mental load on your opponent. Understand the specifics about how Dominion's processes turn so you can take advantage of that in your planning. Control M is your friend. And then, in order, make sure you shape the sphere of operations through careful planning, deployment, deception, etc. Make sure that you have the initiative in that operation by using the tools that are available to you to deter action by your opponent or by others in the lead up to your operation, so that you can seize the initiative, usually by launching an initial offensive. If we were to talk about how to seize the initiative on the defense, that's probably the topic of a different video. This is already stretching pretty long, but you seize the initiative by maximizing the number of threats that your opponent has to respond to, and making sure that the sorts of threats that require greater resources to respond to than they take to launch, and which cannot safely be ignored. This is why raiding with small groups of elves is so effective, because you have to guess where they're going or if they're going to stealth, and you can't ignore them, because if you ignore them, eventually your economy will fall apart. And then move into the dominate phase and make sure that what you're doing is tied to your goals. If you are only after a few concessions, it's enough to make your opponent's life miserable a lot of the time. If you're in it to win it, then it's about reducing your opponent's economy and army so that they have neither the ability to recover their economy using armies, and they don't have the economy to produce new armies. Simple enough. Then make sure you get the best value out of your land and smile as you remember that you don't have to deal with civilian authorities or human rights because you're playing a game of Dominions 5. So, that's been a bit of a different sort of video. I'm hoping that the patron who commissioned it is happy with the direction I chose to take it. This is the first time I've had a commission which isn't for like a nation analysis, so it's something a little bit different. I know it won't be for everyone, but for those of you who have stuck with me through the end, hope you found it interesting. Hope it's given you something to think about, given you a little bit more of a framework and a guide on how you might plan a campaign in Dominions, how you might think about what you're trying to accomplish and how you're going to accomplish it, and getting inside your opponent's head, and remind you to do the steps that are often forgotten, like making sure you do the logistical prep, that you have a plan to deter opponents from acting while you're planning to act, and then you're maximizing your initial impact and your chance in the war to come. Hope you found it interesting. I'll see you all again soon. It's been a difficult fortnight down here in Oz. My work waxes and wanes as COVID does, and it's been a bad time for COVID. So I apologise for the low rate of videos and how long this one has taken out. But as I said, I hope you enjoyed it, and I'll see you all next time.